The Aral Sea, once the fourth largest lake in the world, bigger than Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. The Aral Sea was larger than the whole state of West Virginia. Now the Aral is not even in the top 20 largest lakes. In fact, it's a tenth of its original size, and is two separate lakes with a combined size of 2,600 square miles, which is about the size of Delaware. How did a lake which was once one of the largest bodies of fresh water disappear and leave behind a desert? What happened to the Aral Sea, and what do t-shirts have to do with it? First, let's talk about the Aral Sea and a bit about its history. The Aral Sea is in Central Asia, between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. There are two rivers that feed the Aral, called the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, which flow from east to west from the Pamir Mountains near the Himalayas towards the Aral. The sea has had multiple phases of rising and falling water levels throughout history due to dry seasons and glacial melt. The sea was inhabited by fishermen and farmers since ancient times. North of the Aral Sea are grassy steppes, which were sparsely populated by nomads for most of history. Even today, this region is sparsely populated and is mostly flat grasslands. The region south of the Aral has seen major shifts throughout history, dating as far back as 5000 BC, with the Keltmar culture being one of the earliest known sedentary peoples to live here. Other Bronze Age cultures have migrated here and were later conquered by the Persian Empire in the 6th century BC. Several more conquerors have taken control of this area, including Alexander the Great's successors, Neo-Persian empires, Islamic empires, the Mongol Empire, and the Timurids, finally the Russian Empire. The timeline of this region is fascinating and worth a video in its own right. Farmers have been using the waters of the Sir Darya and the Amu Darya for thousands of years. It was even noted that in the early 15th century there was less water flowing into the Aral as it was being diverted for irrigation upstream. The Russian Empire began to take interest in the region in 1839 and established a permanent naval base on the Aral Sea in 1847. As the Aral was not connected to any other body of water, the Russians disassembled two ships and transported them overland, reassembling them and creating the first Aral flotilla. They even brought two steamer ships to exert influence on the sea and its two main rivers. After setting up this base of operations, Russian expeditions in the region increased, and by 1873, the region became a semi-independent Russian protectorate. Later in 1920, during the Communist Revolution, anti-monarchists joined with the Bolsheviks to depose the king, and the region became part of the Soviet Union. As part of the Soviet Union, irrigation projects increased over time to make the region more productive. Large-scale construction began in the 1930s, but greatly increased in the 1960s. The Soviets diverted water to the desert to grow things like melons, rice, cereals, but most importantly of all, cotton. Now, cotton is a very water-intensive cash crop, which required these massive irrigation projects. Their plan succeeded and made Uzbekistan the world's largest exporter of cotton by 1988, and even today, cotton is a cornerstone of Uzbekistan's economy. So, is the answer they simply sucked the Aral dry by not realizing how much water they were using? Well, yes, but that's not quite the story of the accidental environmental disaster. The irrigation canals built by the Soviets were hilariously bad, allowing for leakage and evaporation. Between 30 and 70% of the water carried by the largest of these canals went to waste. Even by 2012, only 12% of Uzbekistan's irrigation canals were waterproofed. So, is the answer that they were just incompetent and didn't know the consequences until it was too late? Well, not really. Not only did the Soviets know the sea was doomed to dry up as early as 1964, many Soviet experts considered the Aral Sea to be nature's error and was going to evaporate anyway. Those who were watching the sea disappear in front of their eyes were powerless to stop it, as nobody would go against the plans of the Soviet Politburo. From 1960 to 1998, the surface area of the Aral had shrunk by 60%, and it was no longer a freshwater lake. The Aral Sea was saltier than ocean water. It was even saltier than the Dead Sea. The shrinking and salination of the Aral Sea caused ecological collapse, leading to mass extinctions of endemic species. The shrinking sea left behind huge plains known as the Aralkum Desert, which is now covered in salt and toxic chemicals from runoff, industrial project, and of course, weapons testing. In fact, an island in the Aral was used for a biological weapons lab where, in classic Soviet form, there were several accidents and shoddy engineering. One event even caused a strain of smallpox to get out, which infected 10 people, and 3 of whom died. As the USSR was dissolving, Soviet military authorities hastily terminated work on the island and evacuated, and of course, did not properly contain or destroy the biological agents, and in recent times have started to develop leaks. In 1987, the Aral had split into 2 bodies of water, the northern and southern Aral Sea. And in 2003, the south divided into the eastern and western basins. The North Aral was saved by a dam spanning across a narrow point, separating the north and south, which is why we still have the Northern Aral for now. The eastern basin had completely disappeared by 2009, while the western basin, being one of the deepest parts of the Aral, is still around. However, this part of the sea continues to evaporate and become saltier each year. The tragedy of the Aral Sea is more than just environmental. The fishermen of the region once provided 1/6 of the Soviet Union's fish, and now the fishing industry has been all but destroyed, causing mass unemployment and poverty. The desertification has caused water shortages. The pollution has caused much higher rates of cancer and lung disease, as well as several other health impacts from the toxic dust storms that sweep the region. These disastrous consequences impact at least 4.4 million people who live in this area. In response to this disaster, conservation efforts in the North Aral have been working and have stabilized the water level. Even fishing has returned here. Water management is critical to the revival of the Aral. Until more investments are made in conserving water in the south, it will likely remain a toxic desert.